One of the traditional elements of a superhero is that they usually have power, and know how to wield that power responsibly, never using excessive force when taking out their enemies. Even the heroes who aren't strictly averse from killing their enemies are known to temper their aggression and only take a life when strictly necessary. We're not talking about those heroes today. Welcome to Top 10 Nerd. I'm Andrew Boyd, and today we will be taking a look at the top 10 most brutal superheroes. We're stretching the definition of a superhero a bit, so you can expect a lot of anti-heroes to make appearances on this list. With that out of the way, let's dive right in, starting with number 10, Rorschach. Walter Kovacs had a pretty rough upbringing, being raised by a less than ideal mother before being made a ward of the state. He was bullied there too, although through his schooling it was discovered that he was an extremely intelligent boy with a real skill at boxing. When he grew up, he became a garment worker until the murder of a woman who was killed in front of several witnesses, who all didn't even try to help her, inspired him to become a costumed crime fighter. He used a special fabric that changed with temperature and pressure to make a mask for himself, and he became Rorschach. Rorschach was a decently respected hero, even working with the other heroes as a member of the hero team the Crime Busters, but after seeing a particularly cruel and disturbing crime scene, his mind snapped, and the Walter Kovacs side of him died, leaving only the brutal Rorschach. Rorschach has been known to treat the criminal element with complete disdain and cruelty, having no qualms about using intense violence in his interrogations, like when he crushed a drinking glass in a man's hands. He is lethal to his enemies, having dropped men down elevator shafts, set men on fire, burned them with cooking oil, electrocuted them, and drowned them in toilets without showing the slightest bit of remorse. Number 9, Wolverine. You know who Wolverine is. He's the fuzzy Canadian with a healing factor who was experimented on by the Weapon X program and given adamantium claws. He has been a member of several superhero teams such as the X-Men, X-Force, and the Avengers, but he is much more brutal than a lot of his teammates. I mean, he has knives coming out of his hands. That obviously makes him pretty brutal, but considering this, he does try to restrain himself from being too violent. Unfortunately for his enemies, he has a tendency to fly into a berserker rage where he becomes a flurry of claws and anger. I could sit here and tell you specific examples of his brutality, but pretty much all of them just boil down to him using his claws to leave rooms full of corpses that have been cut into a bunch of tiny pieces. Number 8, Spawn. Al Francis Simmons was a mercenary for the US government before being killed by one of his fellow mercenaries. Due to all the murder, Al was sent to hell, but he made a deal with a demon named Malbolgia and agreed to join Hell's army as a Hellspawn. He was sent back to Earth, where he discovered that 5 years had passed and that his wife had remarried and started a new life with his best friend. So he became Spawn and spent the rest of his time brutally dispatching violent criminals and fighting evil demons. He can use his demonic powers to go up against his enemies, but he is just as likely to use his bare hands to straight up tear people in half, or in one case, stab someone to death with an ice cream scoop. Number 7, Dogwelder. Dogwelder is a member of the DC Super Team Section 8, which consists of some of the intentionally worst superheroes in comic book history. There is Six-Pack, who is a drunk man who attacks people with a bottle, Defenestrator, who carries around a window pane that he breaks over people's heads, or Bueno Excelente, who, well, the less said about him the better. One of the more brutal members of this lame team is the Dogwelder. He never speaks, and his whole deal is setting up traps in alleyways to capture and euthanize dogs. He then carries around the dead dogs until he comes across a villain. Then he uses his welding torch to weld the dog to the villain's face. That's it. That's his whole deal. And he has only made 6 appearances in the history of DC, although in one of them he did weld a dog to Lobo's butt. Number 6, Moon Knight. When Mark Spectre was a child, he discovered that his rabbi was actually a former German SS officer who had deserted at the end of the war and was posing as a rabbi in order to end the lives of members of the local Jewish community. Mark escaped, but the trauma of this caused him to develop dissociative identity disorder. His first alters were Stephen Grant, who invested Mark's meager funds and became a millionaire who funds their superhero activities, and Jake Lockley, a rough and tumble cabbie who uses his position to gather intel on the various crimes going on. Mark became a mercenary, and after having been critically injured, made a deal with the god Khonshu to become his fist and punish evildoers in his name. He developed the superhero personas of Moon Knight as well as Mr. Knight, who is also also a hero, but wears a posh white suit rather than a big white cloak. Moon Knight can be brutal with his enemies, often branding them with his logo or straight up killing them. Some of his worst moments include gouging the villain Truth's eyes out, or ending his battle with Raoul Bushman by cutting off the guy's face. Number 5. Homelander. The result of Vought American's Compound V experiments, Homelander is a narcissistic psychopath with all the powers of Superman, and is considered the most powerful man alive in the boys' universe. While he is the antagonist of both the comics and the series, he is technically a superhero, even if in occupation only. Homelander is extremely powerful, but considers himself above humanity, and thinks himself invincible, often using his powers to horrifically kill people who get in his way, annoy him, or even just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time when Homelander is bored. Some of his more brutal murders include him dooming an entire airplane filled with civilians, taking off the vice president's head, and in one issue, flying a family and their car into the sky before dropping it. He is probably the most sadistic character on this list, but since he is only considered a superhero by technicality, I put him right in the middle of the list. Number 4. Lobo. Although this space bounty hunter is more often villainous than heroic, his time on the Justice League makes me comfortable giving him a spot on this list. Lobo is the last of his own species because he destroyed everyone else in what he called a science project. He gave himself an A, by the way. In his years of bounty hunting, he has destroyed several planets and countless lives, and has shown little in the way of remorse. Like Homelander, he is on this list near the middle because though he has technically operated as a superhero, there is very little about him that is actually heroic. Number 3. Ghost Rider. Johnny Blaze is a motorcycle stuntman who, in an effort to save his surrogate father Crash Simpson from dying of cancer, made a deal with the demon Mephisto. Mephisto promised to cure Crash's cancer in exchange for Johnny's services. Unfortunately, Crash perished in a stunt gone wrong almost immediately afterwards, and Johnny became Ghost Rider, becoming bound to the spirit of vengeance, Zarathos. When transformed into the Rider, he has super strength, is essentially immune to damage, and can manipulate hellfire. Perhaps most iconic is his penance stare, which causes its victims to experience every bit of pain they have ever inflicted on other people, resulting in guilt, pain, and trauma. In one of the most brutal examples of the penance stare's power, Ghost Rider used it on a man who then broke his own neck with his bare hands to end the pain. Number 2. The Punisher. Frank Castle was a Marine whose family was killed in the crossfire of a mob attack. Frank survived but was deeply traumatized, and when his family's killers went free due to police corruption, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He became the Punisher, and began using his military skills and tactics to wage a brutal one-man war on crime. His extreme methods have brought him into frequent conflict with both the villains and the heroes of the Marvel Universe. Frank has no personal life to speak of, and tends to avoid friendships in general, choosing to spend all of his time plotting, hunting, or killing criminals. He is a lunatic, with nothing to lose, but fortunately for the good people of the Marvel Universe, all of his insane fury is directed at the criminals of the city. Some of his more brutal kills include feeding a man to polar bears at the zoo, using his obese friend to smother the Russian, or kicking a limbless crime boss into a raging fire. Number 1. The Spectre. The spirit of vengeance in the DC universe first appeared in More Fun Comics number 52. He was originally a demon called Aztar, who was helping Lucifer try and take control of heaven. He eventually had a change of heart and surrendered to the Archangel Michael. As a means of atonement, his memory and consciousness were wiped, and he was transformed into the Spectre. He is a divinely powered being capable of almost anything he can imagine, can travel between dimensions, and can shoot energy blasts. He's immortal and capable of flight, intangibility, possession, telepathy, and telekinesis, just to name a few of his powers. In order to temper this power, he must be bonded to a human host, with this most often being Jim Corrigan. Spectre has no limit to his power, but is bound by the morality of the host, who often prevents him from unleashing the full wrath of God upon his enemies. He has killed people by aging them to death, melting them, cutting them in half with giant scissors, turning a man into a sentient and feeling mannequin who was then dumped in a fire and painfully burnt. He turned a bunch of junkies into his fingertips and then injected them with liquid fire, and in one extreme case, burnt down an entire country. Any other brutal superheroes you didn't see listed here? Let us know in the comments below, And remember to like and subscribe for more Top 10 Nerd.